Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bajalan, and I'm here on the TIR channel with our very special monthly gaming show, Gaming Materialists. And this month, we're going to be tackling a juicy topic. We're going to be talking about World of Darkness, better known to most role players as the world in which Vampire the Masquerade takes place in. Now, this is a game that I've played a lot of in my late teens, early 20s, and also is a game beloved by my Gaming Materialists co-host, the bad dad of the left, the bane of Infra Has fans and Doug Lane's life, the one, the only, C. Derek Vaughn. Hey, C. Derek Vaughn.
Hey, way to start a rap beef. Yeah, we're talking about ATL's own White Wolf Games and Vampire Masquerade, the kind of flagship game for it.
So let me just get people who don't know what Vampire the Masquerade is in the know about what Vampire the Masquerade is and what the World of Darkness is. So it is a role-play game, if you're not aware, and it was a massive role-play game, particularly in the 1990s, which started around people playing vampires, and vampires in the real world, or a kind of dark reflection of the real world called the World of Darkness, which bred a whole load of spin-off games, including Werewolf, Mage the Ascendancy, Changeling, the blah, blah, blah. There was tons of them where you could play supernatural creatures. It was a very popular game in the 1990s. There was a whole load of IP issues in the 2000s, and it's had somewhat of a renaissance in recent years with the launch of, I believe, 5th edition, which is a return to the original World of Darkness after a decade or so of a hiatus from that. So it is a popular game and was very much a tone setter in the role-play game world in the 1990s, and for a certain time, in many ways, eclipsed the big bad Dungeons and Dragons that we all know today, and that is going from strength to strength. Now, Varn is somewhat of a minor expert on this, so I want to ask you, Varn, what is Vampire the Masquerade, and what are the origins of Vampire the Masquerade, and more particularly, the company that published it, White Wolf Publishing?
So, Vampire Masquerade was a tabletop RPG that focused on, they would call it the goth punk aesthetic, aimed largely at teenagers and young adults, that was based on a highly, actually, funnily enough, according to the documentary produced by some of the people around White Wolf, it was based on Gary, Indiana. They would go through Gary, Indiana, and the shittier parts of the Rust Belt in trips to Gen Con from Atlanta to Chicago, and it was a lot of these places were former industrial cities that were totally hollowed out, and that's where they got the atmosphere for Vampire the Masquerade, according to Martin Hagen. Now, White Wolf Publishing started off as White Wolf Zines in the 80s. It was a role-playing zine with some other stuff involved. It was run by the Wreck brothers, who were two brothers in rural Georgia who eventually moved to Atlanta. They met at Gen Con, where they would pass out their zines, and their zines kind of became a big thing at Gen Con, and they met Mark Renhagen of Lion Rampant Games, the writer of Magica, which is a game that I still play, and it also has a troubled IP history. And they developed Vampire, which was kind of shocking. There were other games that are precursors to it, other than Ars Magica, which is also a big part of the weird world of the World of Darkness and the many IP issues that, come out of this. So where does White Wolf come from? Well, White Wolf was a fanzine that was actually based off of, the Wreck Brothers' love of Michael Moorcock. And it was a very small zine. I've never actually seen one of the zines, but I was into zine culture in the 90s myself, and so it was kind of legendary as from the gaming end of zine culture as opposed to the punk music scene end of zine culture. What made White Wolf interesting, and again, the recent documentary kind of goes into this, but this is actually kind of how I got into this world, is it was adjacent to two different subcultures. So it was adjacent to the gaming subculture, but it was also explicitly adjacent to goth club subculture. And it was aimed a little younger than the people at that, although they talk about how much they were in the scene. So if you were going to the Masquerade, which was not named after Vampire the Masquerade, but it was a big club in Atlanta, goth club, or the Chamber, which was a goth sex club, effectively. The fashions that the art were coming from are literally coming out of that scene.
Because just so people know, in 2017, there was a World of Darkness documentary, which is let's just say a rose-tinted glasses view of the origins of World of Darkness and Vampire the Masquerade, but it has interesting interviews with people. And I think there are some big claims that Vampire the Masquerade was influencing the goth culture, but I think the
reality is probably the other way around.
Is way the other way around, where these nerds were going to goth clubs and then drawing pictures of the outfits that people were drawing, people were wearing in those goth clubs. So yes, I think that's an important point, that this is gaming, but also draws heavily on this goth culture, which is exploding in the 1990s. And of course, from your state, right? From Georgia.
Yes, from Georgia. So how I encountered Vampire Masquerade is I was 13 years old, and my mom was trying to get me in the role playing so that I would not get in other kinds of trouble, which, working class youths who were often home alone were known to do. You can figure out what that would be. And we started off with a bunch of secondhand D&D products that were bought from literally like secondhand bins and swamp meets and flea markets and stuff, because that's how overproduced TSR was at the time. But my mother went to a gaming shop, a comic shop in Augusta, Georgia, when I was visiting some family, and we found a GURPS edition. So, Universal Wordplay Steve Jackson, and this isn't in any of this stuff. So they had early Vampire had a deal where they had 2 rule sets, and this is largely forgotten. One was done with Steve Jackson games, where they sub-licensed for Steve Jackson games, which I think I remember hearing that they didn't even get totally paid for. And then the other was White Wolf's own product. Well, I actually encountered the GURPS version first. It was easier to find in this little comic shop in Augusta, Georgia. And my mom thought it was something you could incorporate into Ravenloft, the scary D&D supplement.
Yeah, which is the vampire-orientated D&D.
Which is super gothic, but also not. It's D&D. These two systems are not, even with the GURPS version, are not super compatible. So we kind of get exposed from that, and then Werewolf comes out. We're freshmen in high school. D&D is becoming really passé, and even back then, you notice that you can get women to play, or at this time girls, to play White Wolf games, and you can't get them to play D&D.
Yeah, I think that's something that people who I guess didn't game in the 80s or in the 90s when we were gaming, and I mean, I gamed in the 90s, not in the 80s. But Dungeons and Dragons was very, I guess, crunchy to a certain degree.
Yeah, particularly by this time period, right? Like this is like when the rules compendium are coming out, and
so there's all kinds of rules. It's very, very male orientated. It's not, I wouldn't say it's a role play. The role play aspect of Dungeons and Dragons really seems to be kind of secondary to the fighting and doing silly things, whereas there's a complete shift in the kind of narrative when we talk in the orientation of the game when we talk about vampires. So we've discussed this before on this show, but Dungeons and Dragons comes out of tabletop wargaming, and so that wargaming legacy sort of is very much evident today. Obviously, things are a lot different with all this very role play heavy 5e that people play now that is very open to women. But the shift with Vampire the Masquerade was that it wasn't so much being presented as a game, but as a story and an interactive story.
Yeah,
the
focus
Master was
on
storyteller.
Right, literally called the storyteller. And while storytelling games in the indie gaming thing and the aughts become a separate thing, and we kind of can't conflate them. These were heavily storytelling driven. The mechanic was simple. It was based on a 10-sided die, and you rolled more of them depending on how good you were at a thing. And if you could role play something, you normally could do it just as easily as rolling it, which was completely different from things like Rollmaster, RuneCrest, a lot of the Chaosium games. The other thing that we forget, though, is Dungeons and Dragons can't shake the taint of the 80s evangelical scares, particularly in the South. Weirdly, Vampire the Masquerade doesn't come with any of that, even though it's way more explicitly got...
There's literally devils. There was literally a supplement, Demon I didn't know what it was called. What was the demon one called? Do you remember?
Demon
the Fall?
Demon the Fallen. Yeah.
Something like that.
Demon the Fallen. And the other thing is like White Wolf had Black Dog books, which is something that would drop later, but that was explicitly mature. Now it was mature aimed at high schoolers, really, or is like a 20-year-old's idea of mature. So you just throw some naked people in the art and some more and some sex with your violence, and there you go. But because it was off the radar of the churches, frankly, in the South, it also had a chance to grow. All right. And then that's really weird. There were other games that was like that too, but were not heavily distributed in the United States. For example, the Moorcock games put out by Chaosium, or even Call of Cthulhu, never got the satanic backlash that Dungeons and Dragons did, which is hilarious. But so there you go. Now it explodes very quickly. I mean, they aren't kidding. Apparently, the corporate propaganda in the documentary is pretty much true. They go from a small company of a bunch of a guy who's run a very small but very good conceptual game called Ars Magica with two zine makers who they live in a house together in the suburbs of Atlanta and distribute their stuff at Little 5 Point. After taking Vampire the Masquerade to Gen Con with the art that it had, it blew up. I had that first Mark Renhagen book edition. So it blows up overnight. White Wolf becomes White Wolf eclipses TSR very quickly, actually, as the main gaming thing, because Chaosium's in a weird dip in the 90s as well, even though it's an older company, and Games Workshop is so prohibitively expensive at this time because of the difference in exchange rates, that like a lot of like Warhammer Fantasy, for example, never really took off in the States the way it did in other places until later. So you have this massive market, and you have the other thing that it does is it comes out of zine culture. All right. Now zine culture has a long history with D&D, but in the 90s, zine culture is associated with music, punk, and politics. And so people like me who were also when I was a 14-year-old, I was actually beginning to write zines and cover shows, were also attracted to this game because it pulled aesthetics from these underground goth and punk shows. So it hit a sweet spot where if you were an edgy teenager, you had a game that you didn't feel embarrassed to play. Now,
yeah, I think that's a really important a shift that takes place. Is this aesthetic shift? So, Vampire the Masquerade, and just so that people can understand how quick the rise is, by the mid to late 90s, we're talking about they have a whole range of fiction books, and they even had a brief TV series, which is terrible, but like on a mainstream channel, they have a Vampire the Masquerade.
Came on after X-Files.
Yeah, Vampire the Masquerade. So this is a huge explosion in a very short period of time. And I think it picks up some of the existing role players, but it opens it up to a whole new field of people who would never have considered role playing before because of the art and the aesthetic, which is basically cribbed, basically sort of in the same way
from the Goth Atlanta club scene and from like the industrial Midwest.
And then you have the gaming system, which is very simple, but also allows you to play games where it's not orientated around fighting, but rather, role playing, social interactions, and things like that. So, and it has a world and a lore which is interesting and deep and can really draw people in who might not be, for example, excited by a fantasy world. It has this kind of gritty, realist pretensions, which I think appeals to a lot of people who are not so attracted to fantasy. And I would say that the aesthetic of vampires that Vampire the Masquerade sets in the 1990s has a similar influence to the way that something like Dragonlance influenced the way that we view fantasy, because a lot of if you look at there was the movie Underworld's movie series, there was a legal case over that to do with stealing ideas from Vampire the Masquerade. Blade was heavily influenced by Vampire the Masquerade, and even something like True Blood was basically, if you played Vampire the Masquerade, you're like, yeah, these guys are basically just played Vampire the Masquerade and I'm making a Vampire the Masquerade TV show without acknowledging that it's a Vampire the Masquerade TV show.
Right. So, I mean, some of the claims like that Twilight was influenced, I thought was a little bit of a stretch because I'm like, no, Twilight's influenced by the other things that ripped Vampire the Masquerade off. But I was also a little bit
is a little bit different, but the hierarchy of vampires, all these Vampire the Masquerade
werewolf versus vampires and werewolves being associated with Native Americans is actually straight out of
Vampire the Masquerade.
Vampire the Masquerade, World of Darkness, Werewolf the Apocalypse. And okay, so we always talk about this from the business production system. The other innovation that isn't generally copied now, but was brilliant at the time, and we'll get to how it leads to the downfall, is that the book sales were not driven around expanding mechanics. They were driven around progressing a meta plot.
Mm-hmm.
And so you had different mechanics that it could use the same world. So the LARPing scene, which is really why Vampire Masquerade takes off, and Vampire Masquerade kind of uniquely works as a LARP, as opposed to the other World of Darkness.
And LARPing is live action role playing for people who don't know, where people dress up as vampires. And there was a lot was made of this in the documentary, which it was a very big scene. I do have to admit that I think there was major rose tinted glasses about the LARPing scene because there was a lot of harassment and abuse in the LARPing scene.
Yeah, no, I was listening to that. They were talking about it's kind of like therapy, and I'm like, that's funny because what I remember is because of the sexual nature of vampire, honestly, and because also there were a lot of people who were underage. Like I started LARPing. I joke about this, but I started LARPing to not get into drugs when I was like moved out of my home at age 17. But it's kind of true. And we're a bunch of teenagers, and there are women involved, and there are also teenage girls involved. You can see where this goes.
Yeah.
It did have for the 90s an unheard of about 50-50 gender ratio, and was also, even though we can talk about how I will say in this case ham-fistedly accidentally racist, but at the time the use of ethnic stereotypes were actually done to include non-white people into the game.
The Assamite book where all the Middle Eastern vampires were assassins, and the Ravenor.
Evanos book where all the Roma are
their own vampires. And then
there's also the problem with the fact that this game, and particularly when you get into the Dark Ages games, uses real history, but retells it from the standpoint of all these monsters being real. But that means that there's all these monsters incorporated into actual historical events.
Religions.
Religions, yes.
Like Mithras is a Ventru vampire.
Right.
And I do remember though, and I have it upstairs. I found all my White Wolf collection, which was huge. They had the Dark Ages vampire Middle East book, which actually dealt with the topics quite sensitively, and the Mongol book, which was quite sensitive towards these topics. But yes, by today's standards, I think by today's corporate standards, a lot of what was going on in those books, both to do with ethnic stereotypes and also, I guess, with gender to a certain degree, probably wouldn't get past.
It wouldn't fly now, but and I'm not saying this to defend it, but at the time, a lot of us viewed it as progressive. It was also the only time where I saw a lot of Black people at events. We had a major, some of the people I worked with when I ran a LARP was was gay Black men who were really into it in Georgia in the late 90s, early aughts. And we all talk about how we go back and read that stuff and it seemed very attractive and inclusive at the time. And now we're like, oh my God, this is so ethno-essentialist and this, that, and the other. But it was trying to do something that TSR had largely failed at, which was
have a multicultural, multiracial role-play game where everybody was represented, even if that representation was shitty and imperfect. You could still, you in the kind of white Western European fantasy worlds that TSR was selling at the time, there wasn't much space to be a Black person, for example. But if you're talking about vampires in Detroit, then you can be a Black vampire, no problem.
I mean, when you get to Vampire Second Edition, they literally have stuff like Vampires of the Evan Kingdom, which is based off of African myths, and they actually really did hire anthropologists to help them get the stuff right.
I've got that book too. I've got all the good stuff. They had Vampire Victorian Age, which was also quite good. I mean, the books themselves were really interesting books. You could
read them. That was my interest in them, is you could collect lore and read them, and if you followed their resources, you'd learn history, you get into Gothic literature, you get music suggestions. They took the Appendix N approach and also amped that up too, which is interesting. It wasn't in the so they dominate in the 1990s, but they have their first bump in 1995. The TV show comes out. Mark Renhagen tries to start a media company called, White Wolf West out in LA. I remember listening to this and I felt a little bit bad for Mark Renhagen, but I was also like, you should have known this from Gary Gygax doing the same thing in the 80s. Gary Gygax literally did the same thing in the 80s around the cartoon, and it ended the same way. He got axed from the company. and so that happens to Mark Renhagen, the founder of Vampire the Masquerade in specific. Now, if you're in the White Wolf tabletop world, other games are probably more popular than Vampire. Vampires kind of see it as the first one, but it's kind of, and the two that we played the most of were Werewolf the Apocalypse and Mage the Ascension, and then there are really innovative games like Transing the Dreaming and Wraith the Oblivion are actually innovative and beyond just simplifying. Like in Wraith, you play two characters. One of your characters is the dark side of another character, but that doesn't translate to LARPing.
Let's roll that back just a second and let's talk about some of the game systems and how they developed through the White Wolf World of Darkness expansion one by one. So Vampire the Masquerade was obviously sort of set the tone. Mm-hmm. It set the basic gaming systems, which was based on dice pools. Just so that people know, you would have 1 to 5 dots in a characteristic and a skill. So let's say you had charisma 3 dots and I don't know, performance 2 dots. If you were trying to perform, you would roll 5 dice. And then if you got over the difficulty, which would be like maybe a 6 or a 7, the number of successes you got, the number of dice that you got over a 6 or a 7 or an 8, whatever the storyteller gave you, that would be how successful your action was. A very simple system. And then, of course, there were role play mechanics in there. For example, if you did something bad, you would lose a humanity point, which would mean that your character would be becoming more subject to the beast and would be more likely to lose control. So you had all these different mechanics.
You could lose your character by bad roleplay, actually.
Yeah, you could if you went around murdering everybody, you'd lose your humanity and your character would basically die because they became a wild animal and had to be put down. So there was a very interesting interplay between role-playing and mechanics. The mechanics were always based around these dice pools, which is a pretty simple concept.
Yeah, I mean, and the sheet barely had numbers on it. This is another thing that people forget. Like, it had traits, and you had these dots that we were talking about, but you didn't have a bunch of numbers and modifiers or anything like that. And the modifier was decided by the storyteller, pretty much based on difficulty. It was an incredibly simple mechanic. For those of us who played D&D probably incorrectly, and D&D, before Third Edge was also, when it was a roll under system, was also a lot mechanically simpler actually than it became. But it's a pretty simple system. The issue though is the way that the role play interacted with the mechanics. Meant that even though all these games existed in the same world with different coteries and of supernatural creatures with different powers interacting with each other, they actually couldn't exist under the same game mechanics. So if you tried to take a werewolf character into a vampire game, well, honestly, that werewolf character is going to destroy the vampire game because they're just so much stronger. Because the way the game was written for play against itself. So you had this system that was not unified, but a world that was.
Yeah, and just to explain to people, the systems on the surface of it were unified in the sense that all the games worked with this dice pool thing. But the mechanics for the different supernatural creatures, the special mechanics, whether it was their vampire magical powers or their werewolf powers or their mage powers, those things weren't really designed to be played against each other. So you could play Vampire the Masquerade and learn werewolf or Mage the Ascension or all these other games relatively quickly, but the special skills you had were just not designed to be played together.
Yeah. Right, so, which is kind of a problem when you've also set this all in the same meta plot world.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that you have that we should get to is this meta plot thing. Not only did they put a clock on their game as they actually progress the meta plot, which they eventually deliver on in 2003. The other thing that it causes is you still have book bloat. Not only do you have 2 editions of all of these games, 2 editions of most of these games under under the auspices of White Wolf. You also start having them set in different time periods because, again, we're talking about the real world, so you can just set the game like what a Mage Sorcerer's Crusade is set in like the Renaissance. There's vampire, there's Victorian vampire by gaslight. There's also Dark Ages vampire. There's eventually Dark Ages everything. There's Wraith the Great War, which is set in World War II, which you can talk about some problems that come out of that. There's but you can see all these happening, and you can see this drift. But the other thing is, because LARPing is tied to the meta plot, and there are about 3 LARPing associations. There's the main one, Camarilla, which was actually run initially by White Wolf itself. Then there was a couple other ones. One which I remember being involved with, which was out of like Wisconsin, was One World by Night. Now, I know it's hard to believe this now, but when I got into LARPing, I ended up running a Dark Ages LARP in Macon during a summer when I was living with somebody else because I didn't really have a place to stay. And they were the producer of a very small tabletop game called Legend Maker, and they ran a Dark Ages vampire LARP. Some of these used official White Wolf rules. Some of them used house rules. But interestingly enough, when White Wolf goes on crusades for IP stuff against LARPing later, it doesn't go after the house rules groups. It goes after the main group. We'll get to why in a little bit because this is part of its downfall. So what happens here is you have these groups. And LARPing's super popular. Go ahead.
Just to insert here, just so people are aware, there was the LARPing rules. There was a separate set of LARPing rules called Mind's Eye Theater. Am I correct about this?
Right. Although the LARPs actually, this is one thing that the documentary doesn't go into. In America, the LARPs actually start before the Mind's Eye Theater product come out. So there are a bunch of LARPs. One of them was called Athens by Night, which I literally the games that I worked with in Macon were tied to this. And Athens by Night sat down with the Mark Runenhagen book and tried to convert them into role-playing rules using improvisational theater and paper, rock, scissors. All right. Several groups do the same thing. What White Wolf does is, I think, and this isn't gone into why they did it, because it wasn't totally their own idea, but they realized that they had a game that was way more LARPable than D&D. D&D LARPs are complicated, expensive, and require you to go out into the countryside, usually, to go camping for a weekend, cover yourself in foam, and play boffer swords and throw beanbags at people at spells. And while that scene has devoted people, it's a lot more like Society for Creative Anachronism than it is like tabletop role-playing. Vampire LARPs did not require you to wear any weird clothes that you would stand out, so you could do it in a city. Now, it eventually
people did dress up weird, though.
Yeah, I mean, people, it gets more and more and more elaborate over time. But it starts off as you're just wearing heightened versions of stuff you'd wear to a golf club, and then goes from there. So you could do this in a city or on a college campus pretty easily. So people start doing this. White Wolf produces a product for it instead of fighting it, embraces it. The first product is the box, which I have actually never seen the box set. But then they produce these little books that are they're cheaper also than the tabletop role-playing books because they're made. They're
soft cover.
They're soft cover, and they're made to be carried around in person, so they're small. And they simplify the mechanics even more, and they do, you still have the dots, but now you decide rolls based on paper, rock, scissors, which you can do right there. This is probably way more popular than even the tabletop role-playing stuff, but people still bought the tabletop role-playing stuff, not for the mechanics, but for the meta plot, because it was crucial to the sense of having one world that you knew the plot as it was progressing by White Wolf. And one thing that also isn't commonly covered, a lot of the main characters in the White Wolf meta plot were pulled from people working for White Wolf's LARP characters. So they literally, there was like the meta plot was sometimes being taken from events that happened in these LARPing games, particularly in the Camarilla, because it was official. And so you have this happening over here. Now, they try to LARP all the games, but if you've ever played Mage, which is a really cool game, it's not LARPable because part of it's like your creativity with magic.
So just to let people know, so Vampire is the kind of standard, but when we're talking about these other games, they have sort of different gimmicks. I think that's the best way you can put it. They have the same core mechanics about dice pools, but they have these gimmicks. So to give you a brief rundown, I would say in Werewolf, which is the one that comes out immediately afterwards,
and it's really pretty popular too, actually.
And I would say, the second most popular. You're really, really tough. You're a tough noodle, and you can beat people up. But then
you have some kind of magic, but it's not really that important.
Yeah, it's not too dissimilar from the gimmicks behind Vampire the Masquerade. It's just you have some different powers and things like that. But where they start getting creative is some of the other systems that you mentioned. Mage the Ascendancy, where you're a magician, you're an enlightened magician, and your abilities are basically based on what you can imagine. So you would have a certain number of skills, and then you would tell the story player, because I have these certain magical abilities, I'm going to conjure up this thing. So you really invent your powers on the fly. Yep. And so it comes down to how good you are at imagining things. And then, of course,
and how discreet you are, because you have reality paradoxes and stuff. That's the other the limit to your power is your role play ability.
Exactly. So you can come up with something, but then you have to rationalize it. So you have to rationalize it. Otherwise, you take a kind of damage. So you can't just go, I'm going to just zap this person with electricity out of my hands. Depending on what kind of mage you are, you say, I'm going to use this this special device I've made to zap people with electricity, or what have you.
Plausible deniability that it's real. Like that's
otherwise the technocracy will come and get you. So with Mage, and I didn't play Wraith, but they had like a system with Wraith as well.
Wraith, you had a shadow system, and the shadow was actually played by another character in your party, like in your player party. So Wraith is a weird game though. Like, and the thing I would also say is the worlds get weirder and weirder as they develop. Like Vampire's fairly based on goth punk club scene with ancients and some weird Judeo-Christian legends thrown in.
Werewolf is Native Americans fighting against. Basically, it's Native Americans fighting against evil companies that are destroying the environment.
Right, and also this weird evil Scottish clan.
But
yeah. So Werewolf has a very much Captain Planet, but like
with supernatural Captain Planet.
Supernatural Captain Planet with a lot of really essential stereotypes about indigenous people.
And their bad guys were good. They had the bad guy was an evil company called Pentex. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I enjoy about Pentex, I have the Pentex book, is like one of the evil corporations that's part of Pentex is Enderon, which is obviously a play on Enron, which literally turned out to be a very evil complex. And obviously which they have King Beer, which is basically Budweiser. They have Black Dog Games, which is supposed to be them. So there's a lot of jokes in there, but it's Captain Planet with supernatural powers. Then
Mage is a lot like it's a Matrix almost, but with magic.
Men in Black. It's Matrix / Men in Black, where magicians are at war with the people who don't want magic to exist.
Yeah.
And I don't even know the Wraith and the
Wraith and Changeling are different because they don't really have a similar kind of protagonist or antagonist. So like basically reality itself is at war with those two groups. And so with people who are interested in in tabletop RP, actually the later of the first edition World of Darkness games, which is Mage, Wraith, and Changeling, are the more popular, because they are even more innovative than Vampire, and they're pretty unique. But none of those convert to LARP very well. So they purged Mark Renhagen in 1995. The LARPs explode. Now, like I said, LARPing scene had a lot of problems. One, the mix of age groups was between 15 and 25 when it started, on average, which is not a great age group to super encourage hanging out with each other. So there was a fair amount of drug use, which was technically forbidden and all this stuff, but of course it happened. And
sexual harassment.
There was tons of sexual harassment because the aesthetics came from the golf club scene. They were high, and the golf club scene's highly influenced by S&M gear. I mean, we got to be honest. It was a highly sexualized aesthetic attached to this game. Furthermore, the sexy vampire stuff from Anne Rice is all, even though, Mark Renhagen talks about this in multiple places where he says he didn't read Anne Rice, but he ended up incorporating all of Anne Rice anyway because he
still Lost Boys.
Yeah, he still Lost Boys and The Haunting and all this other stuff. Which are all Anne Rice ripoffs, kind of. So he ends up taking it indirectly. This is an irony later for their later lawsuits, honestly. But so there's all this sexiness involved, but there's tons of sexual harassment in the scene. There's also, I mean, it was used by a lot of nerds as a way to meet women, but these are nerds who were incorporated in the gaming scene in the 80s. They don't really know how to interact with women. So this is a big problem. There's also a lot of queer people involved in this, but this is at a time, and the game is pro-queer in a very awkward way, in a very awkward early 90s way.
Everyone's kind of omnisexual, right?
Right. And so you did have a lot of like acceptance in these groups of something like, I wouldn't say trans identity, but there was a lot of proto-trans stuff in the general acceptance of gay and
you could always play as Zemitzi, which was a vampire that could
transcend genders,
gender and all these kind of things. So it was, it's like, if you looking in retrospect, there's like so many contradictions in the World of Darkness, which make it both like super progressive, but also
weirdly
reactionary. Not. Yeah, weirdly not. But
so you have all this, but the LARP scene blows up. It has a lot of scandals that are not covered in anything I've read.
And there's also really glossed over in the documentary. Like the documentary completely wrong. And it's interestingly enough, in the documentary, they only showed the pictures of the beautiful people at the LARPs.
Yeah, I was about to say that was one thing about LARPing is, yes, there were beautiful people there, but there were also a bunch of gamer nerds dressed in club costumes. And there's a couple of pictures where they kind of show it, but no, they also that made it out that people did get dolled up for this, but people like full like theatrical level makeup was rare, because you could, with some of these LARPs, you could literally walk through them on a college campus and not know you were walking through a LARP. Yeah. So, I mean, that was the other reason why they were super big, is they were kind of innocuous. Like, you can play them in a park or college campus or whatever. And
it's just people talking.
It just looks like people talking and playing paper, rock, scissors in weird costumes. But those weird costumes at the time are also plausibly deniable as clubbing costumes. So it's like, so this blows up. And when I say it blows up, it really did. Like when I ran,
we're talking in the space of like 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, so you have the first 4 or 5 years where this blows up in the role playing scene, and then after actually the TV shows when the LARP explodes. These LARPs are international. That like some of the key events, like when they'd have like vampire conclaves or whatever, which is a big deal. You'd have people flying from Europe and South America to the States to attend them. also these LARPing clubs sometimes were as few as 20 people, but like during the height at like 2000 of the Dark Ages LARP that I ran, we had 120 people show up per game and 300 people on roll. Like, and that's in a mid-sized southern city, not a big one. This is not Atlanta. This is Macon. So, and that was true. And these games were particularly popular in the United States, in the Midwest and the West at the time, as well. So like there was a whole lot of this stuff in like Kenosha, Wisconsin, and the Twin Cities, and so while it very much came out of the Atlanta goth scene, it was very popular. Like the base of the Camarilla was in Utah, even the particularly when it split off. So here, however, they hit a problem. They get hit by the TV show bombs. They lose a lot of money on it. Then Amazon happens, and the gaming industry falls out. TSR goes out of business. A lot of the small gaming companies fold up. And basically White Wolf is the only game in town, but they're also kind of struggling. So what they do is, after they remove Mark Renhagen, they take Justin Chile and a few other people, and they relaunch all the games. But instead of starting over, they do fix some mechanics. They add some stuff this or there. This time when they relaunched the games, this is the first relaunch around 1998, they just progress the meta plot and then add stuff and clean up some of the rules and then add glossier art.
And I would add this: they handled the books in quite an interesting way. So, for example, Vampire Society was divided into different clans, and obviously in the first edition you had clan books. So,
right.
So when the second edition came out, they released clan books again. But the way that they did the clan books was that they progressed the story of the different vampire clans, so that the old book was not necessarily obsolete, but rather the lore that you found in the old book was from one perspective, and the one that you found in the new book was from another perspective.
Yeah, so what they were trying to avoid was the TSR problem, right? When every time they rebooted a brand, all the old stuff would be invalidated.
So when you were playing second edition, you would still, if you could get your hand, if you were, let's say, playing an Asimite or a follower of Set, one of these vampire clans,
you wanted the splat book from the original.
You wanted both the splat books because they gave you different aspects of the lore. They would have slightly different mechanics in it, obviously, but the mechanics there wasn't that much difference between these two editions. But you would definitely want to have both the books because they provide you with lore. So it was a clever way of dealing with it. And then, of course, they brought in all this other stuff like Vampires of the East and stuff like that. But yeah, they did a huge relaunch, basically.
They did a huge relaunch. They, interestingly enough, in their whole discussion of this and their documentary, they don't mention this relaunch. They relaunched the LARP products as well, and then they start expanding the product line even more. They include like Orpheus, Demon the Fallen, Kindred of the East, which are not vampires; they're some kind of
demons.
Yeah, they're demons. I mean,
they eat flesh. I seem to remember.
Yeah, they're cannibalistic demon. They're kind of yokai. The issue with them is that they seem like they did actual cultural research, but they did the thing that was still kind of allowable in the 90s and early aughts, where they collapsed all Asian culture into like one mega culture. So there's a mixture of like Japanese, Korean, and Chinese stuff without differentiating them at all. Because Kindred of the East is one of the things that really doesn't hold up now. But they also try to really reach out to more minority stuff. So they launched like Kindred of the Ebon Kingdom, which is set in Africa and uses real African folklore, and actually is a lot less problematic. It's a lot less problematic than Kindred of the East. Yeah,
it's one of the better books.
And they relaunched the Dark Ages line, and this is a hint at what they're going to try to do next. With their second edition of Vampire Dark Ages, they do Dark Ages for all the games now instead of just Vampire. Mm-hmm. And they start trying to subtly standardize the mechanics as best they can. Right. So these actually sell very well. The other thing that you need, because there's so much lore in these, and it's not so much mechanics, is LARPers are still going to buy these books, even though the mechanics in them are irrelevant to them, because they need the lore. And they always wrote these books semi-in character, so if lore contradicted each other, and it often did, it was explained by this is written from a perspective of X, so we don't really have to. So, but this does cause a problem eventually. One, you have the same book expansion that you do with D&D being a problem. And two, and this is kind of a big deal that people miss, the barrier to entry to the game becomes your ability to retain this massive set of lore. So
this is important because because as groups become more experienced in playing Vampire the Masquerade, all these players, and this happened in my vampire group, everybody knows all the bloody lore and they've read all the books, so it's very hard to make a mystery for it.
So you have people who've been buying these books, and they weren't super expensive for the time either, like because the other model that they did that's different than what, say, 5th edition D&D does now, is they did a lot of books, but the core books were big, glossy, expensive books. But these flat books were soft covers. Mm-hmm. They had good art, but they were never in color, and they were kept around for the time, the $15-$20 range, and some of them were as cheap as $10. So they produced a ton of them, though. I mean, like White Wolf would sometimes produce 50-60 books a year. Because they're not just producing a ton for each game, they're also doing it. I mean, they're doing it for now like 10 games, and then they're also launching a new game with the second launch every year. Well, this works until about 2000.
Works very well until about 2000, but then you run out of meta plot.
Right, they're running out of meta plot. They're also oversaturating their own market because there's all these other games they're releasing, but those games aren't LARPable. But you still need the lore in them to keep up with the lore in the LARP games. So people are beginning to get resistant, and they don't buy as much. Okay, so they realize they have a problem, and they also realize that so we're surviving off of one game's really its LARP form in the late 90s, but we have all these tabletop games which are the bulk of what we produce. So we're we have our flagship product, but it's really not expanding out anymore to these other products because people are the investment is just in Vampire, and maybe a little bit in Werewolf and Mage. So then around 2003, they cut ties with the Camarilla. The Camarilla tries to keep all the ownership because the Camarilla people know what's going to happen. They know they're about to kill the World of Darkness in a Gehenna event. Well, these LARPs don't want it to happen because it's going to end. You have years and years of you have years and years of people building characters. Some of these people have. The other thing about vampire LARPs is like death, but character death happen, but not a lot. But you get more powerful. So people are now playing characters that they've made really powerful, that they've really invested in and played weekly for some people up to a decade, and are thus really invested in. And this creates a big old problem for White Wolf because the Camarilla doesn't want to go with them. Because the Camarilla doesn't want to go with them, but the Camarilla wants to maintain trademarks over some of these things. But it's White Wolf's intellectual property, so they sue them. The Camarilla loses. Now, in the documentary, they don't go into why. I mean, actually, to be fair, to White Wolf, it really, the Camarilla was also trying to trademark itself so it would become it would become the only people who had right to run vampire LARPs, also getting rid of all these other organizations that had house rules and stuff that White Wolf had always tolerated, right? They just didn't go after it because they still bought White Wolf books, so they didn't really care. This leads to basically the Camarilla being disbanded by White Wolf suing it. And the Camarilla is the largest organization of LARPers, so it looks like White Wolf is attacking its own fan base. Then they release the new World of Darkness, which is now Chronicles of Darkness, and this is where things go really nutty.
But yeah, so this is kind of where I guess we'll have to tie this topic up, because we've done like the first decade of White Wolf,
right?
Really getting to the weird stuff. But yeah, so people are aware, we have this advancing meta plot from first edition, this bloat of books, huge amount of lore being created. And then, is it 2003, they released the Gehenna book. And Gehenna is this big event that all the different games of their own version of, which is the end of the world, end of days. And they've been hinting at it. There's been story advances to do it. Finally, they released a book, which I actually think I have the book, and I think it's a good book because it offers you a bunch of different ways to have your Gehenna. And then they do a reboot. We'll call it a complete reboot.
Yeah, this is a hard reboot. It reboots the meta plot. It reboots the characters.
Some of the names stay the same and things like that.
Yeah, which is actually confusing. It's one of the things when we talk about this maybe in another episode, that they kept enough of the old vampire to just piss people off. But it was a completely different game. The other thing that they do is they clean up the mechanics, and they also try to get rid of all the problematics, because it was already becoming obvious to them that some of the stuff they've done for inclusion in the 90s was kind of low-key racist, so they clean that stuff up too.
Yeah, because you know what, I think what people don't realize is that, you know, people are pretty unforgiving as we live in the Great Awakening. But, you know, some of the early attempts of these companies to try and, you know, not do a racism often led to them doing a racism by accident.
I mean, you go look at all the attempts at inclusion, it's really bad.
I mean, like, you know, like I said, the Assamites, which were the Middle Eastern vampires, like they were initially in the first season, they were all like cold-blooded killers. Yeah, all terrorists. And then in the second edition, they were like, oh, you know, the assassins are only one branch. They have sorcerers and they have artists. It's like, yeah, good one, buddy. Trying to make it.
Yeah, and then they just remove all that stuff.
But they do this hard reboot, which includes names and elements from the old World of Darkness, but is a new World of Darkness. And more importantly, it's a World of Darkness system, not a vampire system. They have World of Darkness, which is the rule set, and then they have expansion books, Vampire the Requiem, and then a whole, I don't know what the other ones were called. Because
they do a change. We can talk about it.
It's a rationalization of the system.
They rationalize the system. They actually reset the world, take all the particularly in Mage and Werewolf, where there was even more of the whole like racial essentializing, but to include people. They get rid of all that. I actually would argue, somewhat unpopularly at the time, but I think this is increasingly that while Requiem's a mess, which is the sequel to Masquerade, the reboot, that some of the other reboots are actually better games than their 90s counterparts. But particularly like Changeling the Lost is a way better game than Changeling the Dreaming. But they had lost so much faith for their audience, and this is where we can really pick up next time, because this is where things go crazy. And you watch a company, I mean, implode. In a way you watch, I mean, when we get to the end of like the aught teens, you don't even know who owns Vampire really. There's literally different editions and settings of the same game and world are owned by different companies. Like we will get to that point in the next, because it just goes crazy. And yeah.
So yeah, to kind of sum up, so this is we talk here really about the first decade of and a bit of White Wolf, 1991 to about 2002, 2003.
About 2002, 2003, yeah.
And this is like a really critical phase in the company, and then things change radically. The company, I think in 2006, is sold to the makers of EVE Online, which is a big online game with spaceships, and then eventually is sold to Paradox. But again, now there's a reboot. They brought back the old World of Darkness after this hiitus. And
right,
we'll come
and then the other World of Darkness still exists as a game separately.
So there's now two Worlds of Darkness.
Right, and they're owned by different companies.
But there's a salutary tale here, which I think people need to understand about hobby companies. World of Darkness, White Wolf, I would not say is, an Asmodee or a Games Workshop by any means, or even was at the time. But certainly it was a competitor to TSR. TSR went bust and got bought out, right? And, D&D has survived, but it's had a bumpy history. White Wolf is gone. Now it's all different things now. Even your most stable gaming company, it doesn't take much to destroy them in a capitalist system. It takes a couple of bad years, and you can go from dominating a market to bankruptcy.
And interesting, the larger you are as a gaming company, the easier it is to happen. This is like part of the interesting things. Like one of the reasons Chaos Games is still around is it was never super small, but it was also never super big.
So big, yeah. I mean, this is one of the things when people see Games Workshop as this titan, for example, that can survive, and it's a huge titan, but also it means it has a bad couple of years. It does some wrong investments. It could go tits up and be bought.
And the only reason we don't have to worry about that with Wizards of the Coast is Wizards of the Coast themselves got bought out by Hasbro, right? So but Wizards of the Coast just have to like the first game that Wizards acquired wasn't even D&D. It was actually, going back to the origins of White Wolf, it was Arch Magica, which they don't own anymore. I think Arch Magica's license is owned by Atlas Games, which I believe is a Canadian company. But whatever. Like, so you see, even some of these game brands or these game worlds, they've outlived the companies that published them by a lot, right. And they've been traded around.
Right. Because the IP is worth purchasing.
Right. I mean, so if people are interested, we can go into the second half of White Wolf's career and then tie it in, because the second half of the White Wolf career is interesting in that it actually coincides with its decline, coincides with the reemergence of tabletop as a major hobby. Ironically. So.
And so if people want to hear Varn and I reminisce more about Vampire the Masquerade, about White Wolf, about the various games, like, subscribe, leave a comment. Remember to follow us on the YouTubes, or if you're listening to us as a podcast, follow us as a podcast. You can support This Is Revolution on Patreon. You can support VarnVlog on Patreon. This is a common project of both Varn and I, and perhaps if people have other topics you want us to discuss, we'd be more than happy to talk about those things, especially perhaps we've been meaning to talk about some of the OSR games for a while, some of the smaller independent games, but I think we need to tackle the big dogs before we can get into the small dogs first. What do you think, Derek?
Yeah, I think we need to tackle the big dogs first, and this one's. I also think this one's interesting, and that White Wolf is the indie. I mean, like I said, it does actually start out as an indie company. I guess TSR sort of did too, but TSR, during my whole memory of it, I mean, like by the time the what is it, the Red Box comes out, it's already corporate head, kinda. You know, and a lot of his decisions in the 80s are totally purely corporate. What's White Wolf, like, its corporate core is also still run by the same, like, zine nerds who came into it for a long time. I mean, the Wreck brothers are involved until CCP, but, you know, is really in charge. So it's an interesting cautionary tale in that, and it almost seems impossible now, actually, because I'm like, could anyone else do this again? If I thought anybody could, it would have been like Monty Cook games or something. But, like, it's not happened again.
But I think we are seeing, maybe we're not seeing anyone dominate the market the same way as White Wolf did. I think the bar to entry, entry in the tabletop roleplay business is actually a lot lower today with Drive-Thru RPG and Kickstarter.
Right, and actually, that's part of how White Wolf survived for a long time was Drive-Thru RPG.
Yeah, so you have. I mean, think about the technology. What makes roleplay? You know, making a quality roleplay game in the 70s and 80s is actually a bit of a, you know, is tough. There isn't desktop publishing readily available, right? So, you know, you need to have like a proper publishing deal and things like that. In the 90s, desktop publishing makes things a lot simpler, but still we don't really have distribution is not easy.
You still got the warehouse books and whatever. I mean, like, yeah.
Today, you can get print on demand, and there are pretty big roleplay games out there that, you know, are selling hundreds and thousands of copies that are put together on a shoestring. Something like a Mothership, which is a game I really rate. Into the Odd, all these innovative. It's almost like, in a strange way, we've gone from a monopolistic system of role play games to one where there's actually, you know, far more, you know, capitalism is functioning at a lower stage in a sense that you have.
Yeah, although interestingly, it's one thing I would say about that is the printing companies are still more cartelized than they even were before.
Right.
I mean, like, you still have only so many things you can operate these print on demand. But yeah, you get, and there are other White Wolf products that have survived, even though they're not owned by White Wolf. Scarred Lands, D&D supplements. We can get into this because another thing that gets White Wolf in trouble is they produce a whole lot of subpar 3.5 material through sub licensing and stuff. Like, there's a whole lot that isn't covered in any. I mean, the one thing I didn't, you know, I guess we talked a little bit about this, the World of Darkness thing, is it just focuses on Vampire the Masquerade, and it actually doesn't really go into White Wolf's business insanity, except for the weird deal with CCP and EVE Online.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it you know, sometimes companies are a victim of business people who don't know really what they're selling, and sometimes they're a victim of creatives who don't know how to do business. You know, it's very hard.
And White Wolf is a little bit of both.
A little bit of both, yeah, exactly. But you know, the key question that all the listeners should be thinking about is when are me and you going to write a role play game? And what would we write the role play game about?
I don't know. I thought about picking up on something Cthulhu related because no one can sue you over it since it's all public domain. If you guys are wondering, by the way, why there's so much Cthulhu role playing stuff, it's because it's public domain.
The Cthulhu mythos is public domain. This is Mooncrock as well as public domain as well. Conan is public domain. Well, this is the other thing. Is the IP is the issue of IP. A lot of the older things, you know, the IP, the copyright has sort of it's become public domain. But changes in copyright law means that so many things remain not public. Like something like Star Wars should be public domain by now.
Yeah, but it's not. But like John Carter from Mars is. The other thing I would say is because of some rulings in the aughts, you can't copyright gaming mechanics. So, which is weird actually. It is weird that's one of the weird loopholes where, and that is actually thanks to TSR and Wizards of the Coast, is where they got rulings. Well, you can't really copyright mechanics. You can copyright the world, you can copyright specific mechanical innovations, but the basic mechanics are not of any role-playing game are not copyrightable, which has also led to something that
and board games as well.
Board games which led to something that that White Wolf's didn't have to deal with, but would have to deal with now, is between that and open license, other companies can actually make products for your game, which was not possible in the 90s.
I mean, nowadays Wizards of the Coast were probably smart, rather than trying to go against the wind of third-party products for Dungeons and Dragons. They're just like, call it 5e, whatever you want, just don't copy our style and things like that.
Right, and if you do, and actually as a creator, you can even do that as long as you do it through their official sources and share revenue with them. So like if you do it through DM's Guild, you can copy the style. So,
yeah, but there is a ton of stuff. But it's very interesting as well that now, as with so many things, it's the YouTube channels that are launching the careers of new games designers through, people like Matt Colville, who's, has a whole load of 5e supplements based on his series of running games. And there's a bunch of other people who do the things. He's the one who comes to my mind. So it's a very interesting field. We're in an interesting time for tabletop role-playing games, particularly in the sense, I think there was probably a dip of interest in the 2000s due to the fact that video games were getting so much better. But I think people are coming back to it because you can do it through Zoom, which is nice. But there's also something nice and tactile about having dice in your hand and sitting around a table and hanging out with your friends.
Yeah, that's why all this online tabletop RPG interests me, because who would have thought that like Foundry or whatever would figure out a way to replicate that experience, but it not be a massive online RPG? Because the MMORPGs, they have all kind of died actually in the last 5 years. I mean, it was interesting that that's part of the, and I guess when we do the second White Wolf show, that's part of their death. But like also like World of Warcraft, not that important anymore. EverQuest, been dead for a decade. Like that world, interestingly, was kind of killed by cell phone games. So it's
just not as satisfying as having a GM who can react to your like actions. Either people want to, I think people crave a good gaming experience like The Witcher 3 or Mass Effect, where you're kind of in it's almost like watching a TV show.
Yeah, and I guess, and MMORPGs, like for example, Elder Scrolls Online have never been as popular as Elder Scroll games,
Yeah. Or like the Star Wars game. I know, Star Trek game. I know there's a lot of people who play it, but I mean, even the Star Wars MMO, it seems like they've gone a lot more in recent times towards solo content and things like that, because people like the role play experience, and it's hard to role play directly with a computer. You can have a game like The Witcher or Mass Effect where you have a story and a character that you direct through something, which is a different kind of thing from a typical from a tabletop role-play game. But there's something about the possibilities that tabletop role-play give you to invent stories and innovate. And I hope that at some point we'll be able to get a group together where we can actually play online at some point.
A nice, easy OSR system game that's roll under nice and fast. Yeah,
we could play Mothership when the new Mothership comes out. We can play Mothership.
Yeah, we should actually look at that. Man, you want to talk about a cottage industry? Like, there's already a cottage industry of people developing Mothership modules for a game.
I know.
Whose what is it? Their edition 1 isn't even out yet. So
yeah,
it's
I mean, I have all the official stuff. I mean, I love Mothership. I love the way that they put their books together. I like that, maybe that's what we should do, Derek. We should come together and do a Mothership module and find an artist. Class war.
maybe we should.
Class war.
Maybe we should. It's perfect for it, actually. And unlike another game that I love, but is tied up in IP issues, unlike Modiphius's Alien game, Mothership, which is basically the same thing.
Mothership, I think is
not tied to IP.
I like the what is it? It's Pre-Guild, I think, makes the Alien game.
Yeah, it's Free League. Free League, and it's distributed by Modiphius. So it's a good game.
It looks like a good game. I have the Dune game again. That looks interesting, but I think what a lot of games look good, but the proof is in the playing. And what I like about Mothership is it is extremely simple to play and easy for people to pick up, and you don't have to explain complicated mechanics to people. No. Some of those games would work with more experienced role players, but like they really hit a sweet spot with Mothership. Well, on that note, it has been a pleasure, and we will see you next month when we will talk. Well, who knows what we'll be talking about? It depends.
We might finish White Wolf. We might have a guest. Who knows?
Who knows? But as we say on This Is Revolution, we are out.